Right, so the final bit of the PC Revolution track, we're going to be looking at China. Gone from being, when I joined the industry about 5 or 6 years ago, it felt like it was a distant place that didn't really have much of an impact on the global stage. However, and that has definitely changed in the last few years. It's become a very, very important market, and we're going to be talking about why. Just want to introduce my panel. If you could just go along very quickly and introduce yourselves, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So Jim Ying with CV Capital. We're a Shanghai-based investment bank, primarily brokering later-stage investment and M&A deals where the investors or the strategic partners are from Asia, particularly China.
I'm Cassia Curran. I'm the head of business development at Jagex, which is home to RuneScape. Jagex is a subsidiary of Fukan Entertainment. I was previously at NetEase, doing business development as well, where I brought in lots of Western games into China, such as the Trail and the Rim series.
Mo Fadl from Riot Games, head of esports. Naturally, esports streaming, it's a global activity. We have a massive audience within China. Before Riot, I was for many years at Wargaming, a global publishing role, which was key. The Chinese market was key for us to really launch and be successful with some very certain products, and we had a lot of very interesting learnings there.
So I'm Daniel Ahmad. I'm an analyst at Niko Partners. We are a market research firm with 17 years experience tracking the China and Southeast Asia games markets.
Also, if you go on NeoGAF or Rosetta, Dan has you may know Dan by a different name. Cool, so I guess going back to what I was saying right at the very beginning, for a bit of a clumsy question, but I suppose why has China become so important in the last few years? Or I guess why and how? Very broad question, I'm afraid, sorry.
Why and how? I think it's pretty simple. We've just seen a huge boom in China in terms of the market, and particularly on the mobile side, it's just massively boomed. So now China is one of essentially largest market essentially for mobile games, and there have been quite a lot of Western games that have been extremely successful in China. So of course, a lot of Western game developers look to China as a really, really important market.
I would say that China's built up a gaming culture over the past 20 years, and so now the market is worth 31 billion, including PC and mobile. If you just want to break out PC, it's about half of that, it's about 15 billion. There's 300 million PC gamers in China at the moment, so that's, what's the population of the US? 340?
Lots.
Yeah, it's roughly similar. And so just that kind of scale and size, you can see that there's a big market opportunity in China at the moment. And I think one of the misconceptions is that China will only take certain types of games, and whilst MMOs and maybe MOBAs are certainly the biggest titles there, there's always an opportunity for different types of games, as we'll probably discuss.
Yeah, I think with China, the scale is so large. There's so many gamers. It's really hard to say, only these kind of. You can't say that only these kind of genres work, especially not these days. You can't because there's so many. There's always going to be some gamers who will like to play narrative games, who are happy to play premium games and pay for premium games as well. You've definitely seen in the past you had this kind of idea of China is only playing free-to-play MMOs on PC.
That's what it says here, actually, as well.
And that was probably that stems from back when Chinese consumers didn't have so much spending power. There was a lot of piracy. So the only way for game developers to really generate revenues in China was to have always online games, which were impossible to pirate. And free-to-play was really originated as a genre in China. But you're seeing now all different types of genres and premium games rising in China. It's a really getting more and more mature market.
This way, I agree fully. I believe why we all talk about China right now is mainly economics, because China, the middle class is growing. Technology allows something which was very hard 20 years ago. It becomes accessible for a wider audience. The Chinese government is really focusing on developing the country, moving forward. There is a massive audience, but the infrastructure, technology-wise, allows them to become an appealing market, to have the spending power. When you look at comparable to India, Pakistan, massive markets, but the infrastructure is not there yet. In 5 years, we will talk about them like we talked today about China.
I think that it's interesting on 2 points. One is the gaming industry is much more global than many other sectors. So whether it's e-commerce, whether it's retail, it's very difficult for, let's say, a Chinese company to penetrate into Western markets. Whereas gaming is one sector where, because the reason why people game, the type of content does apply across borders, you do see Chinese consumers enjoying the same types of games Western players do. Another area is in terms of the corporate investment side of things. So whereas in Western markets, from professional investors, from VCs, there's limited focus in terms of investing in gaming because the idea is it's very hits driven. It's hard to predict who the winners are. In China, you have a broad spectrum of investors. Not only do you have VCs, but you also have the large corporations like Tencent, Alibaba, NetEase. They're companies, it would be like Facebook, Google, Apple investing in game companies and having them drive a significant portion of their revenue. I think from companies like Facebook and Apple, their belief is gaming is part of their ecosystem, but it's not their primary economic engine. Where you have companies like Tencent, where people think of them as a large distribution player, but the vast majority of their revenue actually comes from gaming itself. And so I think from a corporate perspective, opinion on the importance of gaming in their overall business, a lot of the Chinese companies overweight it much more than Western companies also.
I think, Daniel, like you and I have spoken in the past, Tencent's isn't it like roughly half of their revenue for a year? Is that roughly right, is games?
For games?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about 50%, give or take. It's a bit less now, but 50%.
Also, they own like half the games industry, which is always an
Yeah,
interesting thing to realise.
Largest games company in the world. I don't think people know that as much as they should.
So we touched on this a bit earlier, but I guess it's a bit like a brass tacks question as well. But I'm kind of curious, like what kind of games you see as being popular in China? Like, as it's already been said, like the perception is that there's a lot of free-to-play RPGs, MMOs, and MOBAs as well. What's the, I guess, for you then, Daniel, but like what's the reality of what's popular in something like China on PC?
Yeah, I would say that, if you're looking at sort of the billion-dollar games, then yeah, MMOs, MMORPGs, those are the mainstays that you certainly see. But over the past few years, and certainly maybe a couple of years back, and this past year, we've seen new genres come to the market. So Battle Royale being a big one. PUBG, for example, sold 15 million copies in China alone, which is a huge feat considering it's a paid game. It's not a free-to-play game like the larger titles.
Also, on PC, it's not really officially out either, is it?
It's
in that Steam grey area.
Yeah, so it's on Steam and you can purchase it there. But even if you want to talk about premium PC titles, so Overwatch is another one from NetEase, and so they actually distributed that as a premium title. So it's a $30 game in China, and it's sold through about 6 million units alone. So really that shows you that, yes, free-to-play MMOs and MOBAs are sort of dominating the top of the charts and always the ones you hear about, but there really is a wide range of games and genres that are popular and that can be popular. Because at the end of the day, I don't think anyone here is expecting their game to generate $1 billion in China. Well, they might, but there's always opportunity because it's a $15 billion market, so there's plenty of room to find consumers that are interested in what you have and be able to target them.
I think this is one area where you see the evolution of the Chinese market and consumer tastes evolving also. So historically in China and Korea, it's mostly been free-to-play games that the large publishers have pushed because as a legacy of consoles not being prevalent there, piracy, driving. In order for game companies to be successful in Asia, they had to have basically server-driven games where piracy wasn't possible. Right? So many of the games that the consumers there started playing and grew up with were the free-to-play types of games on PC. Whereas with the entry of Steam and as consumer tastes evolve, they've gotten access to some of the paid games that come through Steam. And many of these are high-quality games, and so naturally they're going to enjoy those titles. And as kind of copyright controls have evolved in China so that people are more willing to pay for titles. They're willing to pay, for some of these paid games also.
I think it was Niko Partners released some research end of last year talking about how much the Chinese premium market's going to be worth in the next few years. And it's staggeringly huge because, again, like China is stereotypically a very free-to-play driven market, due to the cultural concerns I think we just addressed here. I guess I'm kind of curious why there's been that shift from free-to-play to premium. Is it like a confidence thing from publishers? Is it like a cultural shift in terms of people being willing to pay? Yeah, why?
I don't think that you could say it's there's a shift from free to play to premium.
Is it a rise in premium? Yeah.
Rise in premium for sure. And I would definitely say that is again, just as Jim was saying, the consumers, the tastes are changing. They are becoming more mature in that way. They have more income to spend. In previous years, maybe they were resorting to piracy because they just didn't have the money in some cases. And nowadays, there's much more more ability and willingness to spend. And there is more interest in quality. So a lot of the premium games are very, especially from the West, are particularly known to be high in quality. Chinese gamers tend to be quite obsessed with status. So being really into high quality premium games is almost like a sign of status.
The fact they can afford to.
They can afford these games, and they're proud of the fact that they can spend on these games. And so that's, I think, is one driving factor.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree with that. And so we actually tracked premium games back in 2002, 2003, when China's PC market was very small. And back then, we did actually find that 50% of Chinese PC gamers did play premium games, but it was all piracy. It was all just no publisher was seeing any revenue. And so what changed is disposable income has increased. I think the game quality is also a lot higher as well, and the types of games now are a bit harder to pirate in the sense that if you want to play, for example, Overwatch, which is a paid game, you need to be collected online. So you can't really play that by pirating it. So when you look at a platform like Steam, for example, the reason that has become so big is because, first of all, it's got local support from a partner company, Perfect World. And so they actually brought Dota 2 to China. And so that got a lot of people getting a Steam account first, but initially that was all they were using it for, just for Dota. And so when all these high quality games came to the platform, people wanted to try them out, and that's certainly what they did, and they enjoy those type of games. And so now that there's more localization in terms of simplified Chinese titles, there's about 2,000 on Steam. There's local payment systems that are offered, so Alipay, WeChat Pay, Union Pay. There's regional pricing there, because in China, premium games, you can't really sell it for about $60. It needs to be about half of that if it wants to be sold to a mass market. And so really that's why, there's some of the reasons why, not all of them, but Steam has become so big, and sort of premium games are a lot more accepted. And there's one final thing, there's been a bit of a cultural shift to where people do want to, status comes into it, but people do want to have that official version of a game. And maybe you can expand this to the entertainment industry, where people are now more willing to pay for movies and TV shows as opposed to pirate them as they would in the past.
Yeah, and it's not just Dota as well, it's also PUBG, I think.
Yeah,
That is a major...
PUBG was last year, it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
2019.
And having Chinese consumers download the Steam platform just so they can play these specific games, and then they start exactly picking up premium games. I do understand that currently that the number of premium games that Chinese consumers on Steam have is still less than what a typical Western player has, and that actually suggests that there's even more room for growth in the premium market in China.
Background-wise, coming from 15 years ago, starting at Blizzard, community publishing-wise, with a very Western mindset about culture and market, the biggest learning was really to understand the Chinese market, that it's a cultural thing to be games which are social and have the status, like this pay for prestige, let's say it like this, a very accepted, and they're looking forward to, especially now with mobile games. We talk a lot about PC, yes, but especially with the evolving of mobile games which cross-link platforms, going back to PC, to the same franchise, and to the mobile, which makes it way more appealing and easier to have this prestige moment, the status moment, wherever you are, if you're on your mobile platform or on your PC platform or in your social life, you have this status as a gamer there where you can share, here, this is my game, maybe I paid, maybe not, but you have like this very high status, and this is very accepted in China compared to other regions, especially in the West, where people are always very, hey, gamers, we don't want this, we want everything to be equal and free, and if you're free to play. China, culture-wise, is a very, very different background.
Cool. So we touched on this a bit earlier, but about the infrastructure and sort of the government in China. That has also sort of gotten in the way of games released in China. There's a freeze on games being approved in the region for much of last year, from March through to about December, I think it ended. Again, we'll probably want to direct it towards you, Daniel, but I guess I'm kind of curious, what do people need to know now about, if they want to launch a game in China, what do they need to know?
So to launch a PC game in China, you need to find a local partner. One of the laws is essentially that you can't self-publish, so you would need to work with, for example, NetEase or Tencent or other local partner. In terms of the regulations, there was a freeze on new licenses being approved, and so every PC and mobile and console game that launches in China requires a license, and so you would submit the game to the government agency. They would review it, and then if they deem it acceptable based on regulations they have, then they would issue a license. So that has resumed, and that's a good news for everyone. I think everyone is very relieved that it has, but there's still a backlog of about maybe 5,000 games that need to be approved before any new ones can. So yeah, if you are looking at China, then certainly start looking at it now, because I think 5-6 months from now is when you'll start to see newer titles being approved and sent out. And I don't know if you want to talk about maybe Steam and how that works. And
I couldn't disagree more with what you just said.
okay, go
Actually, it does depend on the size of your game. So if you are a Blizzard, if you are have like a massive PC game, then there's no way you can get away with going through any back channels to get your game into China. You do have to have a Chinese partner. It's been incredibly difficult for the Chinese games industry in the last year, where having this stop on approval processes, it's been very hard for smaller Chinese game companies. Quite a lot of them have gone bankrupt, in fact. And quite interestingly, a lot of the games that have been let through already, some of them belong to game developers who've already gone bankrupt. So they've finally got the publishing number, they can release it, but it's too late.
Well, 9 months only revenue, that's got to hurt any company, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's been all right for the more established companies which have the ongoing revenues from the already released games, but it's been very challenging for Chinese developers. But from a Western point of view, it is perfectly possible to just put your game on normal Western Steam and translate it into simplified Chinese. And you can even get like local marketing in China. And because if you're a hardcore PC gamer in China, you really want to play this game, you'll be able to download it, you'll be able to use a VPN and buy it. And I do understand that quite a lot of the premium PC game developers who have gone that route and not gotten a Chinese publisher have found that after translating their game into simplified Chinese, it's become Chinese are now the biggest source of revenue for them for their games. It's nobody really knows what's going to happen with the Chinese government going forward in terms of the approval process, but it is likely perhaps that it's going to get stricter. There's already a difficult process to go through, or just really annoying, where you had to give in lots of very not useful information to the Chinese government and give them a mobile phone. Literally, you have to pack up a mobile phone with your mobile game downloaded into it and send it over to the Chinese government so they could play it.
That's actually
Yeah,
insane.
yeah, and then like the first 1,000 and last 1,000 lines of code, whatever that means, and all the technical highlights. It was quite challenging. It's probably going to get harder, and it's probably going to be limits, just as there are limits in the Hollywood in Hollywood for Western films. There's a limit on how many Western films can be released in China. That's likely going to be happening for Western games as well. And because the approvals process is so long, and then the bureaucracy just can't handle that number, it means that it's going to be quite a slow process even for Chinese companies to release new games and so forth.
Is that going to be like an ongoing concern moving forward, or is that just while we clear this the absurd backlog that's gathered over 9 months of 2018?
Well, certainly the backlog is the first problem, but it's likely that there's going to be some sort of limits on the number of the games that can come through, or can even be processed by the Chinese government. Whether that changes, that's really difficult to say. Yeah.
So I would add, from if the perspective of most of the folks in here are as Western developers, how much to focus on China, when to focus on China, my advice would be don't even worry about China until your game is successful in the West. It's such a minefield in China, whether it's trying to figure out the regulatory approval or talking to all the publishers and finding who's going to give you a good deal. Even if you do find a deal, it's not going to be a good deal until you're successful in the West. Once you're successful in the West, then all of these publishers will come running to you to try to sign you. And at that point, you'll get much, much better terms. Right? The worst thing that can happen is you see developers that travel over to China to find a publisher, and then they're so distracted from making the core game that the core game misses out in the Western markets. And that's definitely what you don't want. China is a huge opportunity, but it's not worth tackling as a Western developer until you've succeeded in your local market.
Yeah, and on top of that, actually, it's Chinese gamers are really interested in Western games that are successful in the West. So your game is more likely to be successful in China if it's got successful in West first.
If anything, the impact of some of the regulations in China and the slow approvals is that many of the Chinese companies, because they realize it's getting more competitive even for them in the domestic market, they want to expand overseas. So they're looking for overseas content to invest in or developers to acquire because they realize, hey, it's getting more and more competitive in China. I need to get out.
The 10-cent effect of investing in Western companies and raking in lots of money. Cool. I think we've just got time for like a few more questions and turn it over to the audience for Q&A. But I was kind of curious about content in Chinese games. I think there's a story at the end of last year where Ubisoft decided to make a bunch of changes to Rainbow Six Siege with a launch in China in mind. They removed references to sex, gambling, I think it was violence, which is odd in a first-person shooter. Well, I guess I'm kind of curious, like, what kind of broadly, what kind of like cultural no-nos are there for a region like China? Again, broad question. I'm very sorry.
Naturally, in the past, there was World of Warcraft. Good examples that we had some with like the undead, like the faction as well. There are some very clear rules, cultural and traditional wise. You cannot cross at all. Like showing bones or like having really actually dying, or the other faction which came in, the pandas, when they were there were some things which were very clearly given by the government direction that this cannot happen in China, cannot be shown in China. As well for League of Legends, when we have like Cassia is one of the champions, who is like as well undead. We have naturally to reskin, we have to adapt it so it fits the market. It's in the end, it's very, very easy. There are rules you cannot go around. Even there are very small, simple ones, replacing in maps, bones lying around. These sound like nothing for a developer and publisher, but these things can be a complete roadblocker, and these things can even lead you down, be completely shut down, and this goes, it will be just more complicated over time, as now as you just talk about content with streams happening. The internet is the internet, it's wide, it's accessible, and even if China has their own streaming platforms, you cannot really control everything. And sadly, it happens often that content is already exposed to certain levels within authorities or governments within China, and they have an opinion that already formed. And then you get to this point that you're reaching out with a partner in China, and and suddenly you have like some very hard resistance without knowing where does it come from. So for one of the big learnings is as well, besides having a partner, it's government relations, to understand the market even before you're thinking to go to this market.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree that it's the. I think that it's currently in a bit of a swing towards more control from the government, swing towards more constrictions on what kind of content is allowable. Yeah, so previously there were definite things that the government would allow, which was became quite clear, which was like you can have skeletons for some reason. So any skeletons you had in your game had to be clothed in undead flesh, which was somehow better. You couldn't, if you had PvP in a game, you couldn't show the body of the player. You had to show like a nice little tidy grave. Then there's things like anything that's too sectionalized. There's, I think, some controls on gambling as well. Now you have to show like the odds of loot boxes, for example, which is actually probably a good thing. I think that, but I think that even Chinese companies had problems with getting their games through the government process, because the government, as almost like a strategy, would not be that clear about what was allowed and what wasn't. It was almost like, well, we'll know it's offensive when we see it. Anything that is kind of very political is just be really careful. Anything to do with battles, historical battles, anything to do with East Asia is a difficult one to get through. And don't mention Tibet, probably is another good one.
No, but there's a very valid point. It was 2 years ago. I went to an esports summit in Asia where we met Chinese officials, and we had a dinner together, and then one of the ministers was very friendly and asked, okay, what does your game, was a different company at this time, brings morally to the youth? You know, it was the first time for me ever being asked by a government official, so what do you bring to the youth moral-wise? And you're not prepared. And this is a question, it's like drop dead questions, and we have some old colleagues here sitting in the audience who are running Asia and know better experiences every day, which is for a Western developer and a publisher, was a complete new world that you didn't think about. And then you realize it's a very thin ice. You make one small mistake, and it leaves a dark spot on your, most likely in your company, for a long time.
Yeah, I think gaming is definitely an area that the Chinese government is looking at very hard now, because it's been so successful, because it's so popular. There is concerns in the Chinese government about the impact upon the youth, as it were. So if there's any ways that you can say that your game is actually improving of the morals of the young youth, it's educational in any respect, that's probably a good line to take.
Yeah, so last year there was a new regulator that was formed, which is now under the control of the Central Propaganda Department. So it's certainly gaming is, there's a lot more eyes on it from top government officials as opposed to a separate regulator. And so what they have, what's been formed separately is also an online game ethics committee. And so that looks at certain games that are submitted to them as to whether it complies with moral and social values. And then if it doesn't, then the game would be rejected. But if it does, then it can be approved. So I would agree with everyone and just say that there's a lot more focus on kind of stricter approval process overall, and then focusing on the youth in gaming. In China, there is a lot more focus, both in media and regulators and parents as well, as to addiction among minors and people under 18. And I'm sure you've seen headlines where Tencent have introduced anti-addiction systems. So, for example, if you play more than an hour a day and under 12, your game time will be cut off and you can't spend or play anymore for a certain amount of time. So there's a lot of sort of things that would be unheard of in the West, but are actually quite accepted and normal and coming into play in China.
Cool. This is the peace revolution, and we are looking. It's quite a future-facing track. So, my last question to the panel is: what does the next year or so hold for the Chinese market? We've got a lot of changes happening, like the regulatory process, which is coming into effect. We've got Steam officially launching in China. We've got Tencent ramping its own Wii game platform. What do you think are going to be like the trends and I guess the trends that are going to shape the market over the next year or so?
If I would 100% know, I wouldn't sit here, to be honest. I would be somewhere else running a company, but most likely, looking now with 5G coming as well, we're just panel before the cloud systems. It comes down to the government decisions, how they're going to approach the internet and the cloud system and the openness with the years to come, especially in this region, as the region is shifting right now, economically wise and political wise, big times happening right now. I believe either way as we turn it, it will focus heavily on the technology around mobile, because hotspots and now 5G becomes like so dominant in the next few years. So if I have to put my money down on something, naturally I would say, okay guys, let's be ready for an advanced mobile experience, which must be more than ever social and easily shareable.
I would say that there's quite a lot of trends in play at the moment. I think one of the biggest ongoing ones will certainly be esports and game streaming. And I think that the amount of investment going into that and how it's being treated in China and in Asia overall, just due to, it's even being presented as an Olympic demonstration sport, and then probably a medal sport in the future, if that goes through. But I think one thing I would say as well is that, Cassia, you mentioned, so Steam, at the moment, yeah, you can publish games on Steam as you would in the West, and that's a really great thing because essentially it operates in a gray area, and so you don't need to obtain a license if you want to put your game on Steam, because Chinese gamers can actually access the game on Steam just fine. They don't need a VPN at this point. They don't need to do anything special. So if you are looking to localize a game, then Steam is certainly one of the first places to go to. And in that essence, you've got Wii Game as well from Tencent. And so they do things a bit more legally. So they go through the approval process. So it's a bit longer. There's obviously a different revenue share scheme involved in that because Tencent is involved as opposed to just the 30/70 with Steam. So as to what happens with Steam next year, I think it remains to be seen. Steam Valve and Perfect World are creating a China version of Steam, and so that will essentially operate similar to Wii Game, where everything has to go through the official approval channel. And so I think the big question is what happens to Steam. Will it be blocked? Will it be something where actually people can still access it just fine and there's no issue? But I think that's one of the big loopholes at the moment, where if you do want to just self-publish a game, you can do that, and you can do it on Steam. And it's good to look into the best practice. I'm sure you can find articles online on how to localize the storefronts on Steam to make your game stand out. But I think that's going to be one of the bigger questions for the premium game market as to, will Steam be here next year, and will people be able to access it in the same way they can right now?
I think two trends you'll see is one is continued consolidation in the market. So because it's already gotten so competitive, because the top line growth of gaming is slowing down in terms of mobile penetration, and rising user acquisition costs, rising production costs, it's going to be harder and harder for small players to kind of grow into the medium and large size space. So the big players are going to continue to consolidate with the regulations and licensing, and even though it's active, the limitation on the number that are being approved, it also makes it harder for indies. I think another area is the growth of PC development and PC games in China. So right now, you see a lot of successful Western PC games being successful in China, but you don't really see that much Chinese internal PC development, because historically a lot of that expertise has come from the console PC space in the West. And even though at this point, I think you could argue mobile development in Asia, China, Japan, Korea is ahead of where Western markets is, definitely in terms of PC console development, the Western markets still lead, because of the long legacy, because of the experience of the teams. But you're starting to see companies like Tencent, NetEase invest in PC development. And also because of how competitive mobile is in China, you're starting to see indie teams, and because Steam is available, they're looking at developing PC games and putting it on that platform also as a way to get around some of the China regulations. So I think that's also, on our side, we see that as an impetus for why a lot of these Chinese companies are investing in acquiring overseas PC development companies, because that's an expertise that they don't have.
Yeah, to add on the esports part, yeah, if you look at it right now as well, for League of Legends, we have like, in China, it's the biggest league. And those pro teams have actual already stadiums there. It's the only country in the world where the league is so advanced because it's supported by officials, by the fan base, the sheer amount of fans they have there. It's like the new celebrity status through streaming, these new platforms where the next generation, millennials onwards, found their new stars. And you can see the level of esports and the business, the base there for the esports case is unique right now on a global scale, even for League of Legends. Each team has their own stadium, high quality, where they have like thousands of fans going there, playing, being streamed with millions, tens or hundreds of millions of people watching on a weekly basis. So yeah, esports will just become more and more a foundation. And this is one thing I would say which is independent from the platform. Because a lot of esports games right now are based on PCs or like other platforms. If they become successful, if they have the beat of the audience, they can last for decades to come because the fan base is there, and especially the business which builds around it will sustain it. And the government loves such activities because bringing people together, team sports, healthy, and it allows non-endemic brands to be a part of a very inclusive audience right now, at least.
Yeah, I definitely agree that certainly last year streaming was a massive, massive trend, and that's likely to continue this year. I also think that, again, the Chinese government approvals, that's going to continue to have an impact in 2019. And thirdly, I would say that premium games will also be a really interesting trend and will continue to grow.
Cool, I think that's all we have time for. I'm being told by the man at the back. So I just want to give a big thank you to our panelists for coming along and sharing their insight. If you want to give them a hand, that'd be great.